Good evening, morning, afternoon, depending on the time zone of where you are. Hello, everybody. So, I'm David Singleton. I will be moderating today this session about automated testing of your Business Central API. The presenter of our 41st Areopa webinar. So, this will be Luc, which everybody knows, Luc van Vugt, who is in charge of all of this and is the one that's basically moved over and taken Areopa to the level we have right now. We are in our third season, which is really great. So what I'm going to first do is give you a quick introduction to the rules that we have, and then I'll give you a brief introduction to what the session is. So please, everyone, your mic is muted. If you have a question, please put it in the question box. If I can answer the question, and it's nothing technical that needs Luc, I'll answer that. But for the most of the questions, we will answer at the end of the session in the Q&A. If there's a question which basically needs to be interrupted, I will interrupt Luc, but that's only if there's something which is specifically a problem with the actual presentation. So please put your sessions in. Now, everything will be recorded. All the recording sessions are recorded, and within 24 hours, you'll find this on the Areopa YouTube page. Now, we currently have almost 600 users, so I'm hoping that this will be the week where we crack the 600. So please remember to subscribe and like the sessions, because that really helps us with the rankings on YouTube. So, if you want to get in touch with the newsletter, that will give you all of the list of when there's a new session coming through. You'll be on an email list. Please join this. And if you're looking for a simple list, you just want to actually go and have a look at the website, go to the Areopa Academy website, and there you can find the information about everything that's going to be happening, upcoming webinars, etc. Okay, now we do have quite a lot scheduled. It has been a little bit on and off because of vacations and everything, but right now we're in the season and things are in full swing. Obviously a small break at Christmas, but a very short one. And I won't go through them because we do have quite a lot of sessions coming up, and we are actually quite packed, and please join in and attend these. But even though we have a lot of data, we are still looking for new topics and new presenters. Keep in mind that this is a different format to most of the presentations you'll see for BC. So if you've never presented before, you want to have a practice, you want to get in front of an audience, this is the perfect way to start. If you haven't presented before, contact Luc and really move. This is a great way to move forward. Most importantly, I want to thank our sponsor, 4NAV. They make this possible. Without 4NAV, we couldn't actually have the session we're doing. And Michael Nielsen, that you all know, will be doing a presentation later about one of his new products that's coming out, which should be exciting. So I'm going to hand it over to Luc. I just want to explain what we're doing. Today is a session designed for anybody that is working with BC and wants to develop APIs. If you're writing APIs, in fact, if you're writing any BC code, the absolute first thing you have to do is think about automated testing. You cannot develop anything for Business Central without automated testing. Luc's going to give you an introduction to that. And obviously, I'm sure everybody knows that Luc is the master of automated testing, and his book will be coming out soon. He's going to explain it during the session. So whatever you haven't learned tonight, and this is just an introduction, buy the book, read it, you're going to learn quite a lot. And at this point, Luc, over to you.
Thanks, David. Picking up my screen, I think it's showing. Yep, everything should be in view. Sounded clear, I hope, David?
Sound is excellent. If anyone has bad sound, just put that in the chat box and I'll address it.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the thumbs up. Of course, yeah, there is a lot more than me, there are a lot more people than me working on testing, but I let's say, I raised myself up already a long time ago when I left Microsoft to get us into automated testing, myself first, of course, and sharing on this. Today, I'll talk about how to write automated tests for your APIs. A couple of technical challenges here, and also the things that actually are common to any kind of testing. While working on this for the book, I learned a lot, and I owe a lot to Arjan Kaufman, of course, and welcome that you're in this session also, Arjan. I learned a lot on APIs, joined his sessions a year ago. I'm not going to claim that I'm an expert on this, but I'm an expert on automated testing, and I wanted to get into that. So I made things somewhat simple for myself. It took a while to get into it, and that's what I want to share. All details you will, like David said, also find in the book. And I also actually ran into this while doing this, came to the conclusion, next to picking up bugs, if you want to start with automated testing, bugs are one of the greatest things to start with to learn the simple scope, whatever. I think APIs is next to this. If you want to get in automated testing and you're working on APIs, get the hell your hands on it to get automated tests in place. And that's what I'm going to discuss today. For those who don't know me yet, but I reckon a lot of us have seen this bald face next to my wife and my daughter when she turned 21. I've been around for a long while, and the background to this presentation, to automated testing, you can find at the bottom. When I worked at Microsoft for 6 years as what's called an SDET, a software development engineering test. Yeah.
Your sound is fading out.
Is it fading out?
Go back closer to the mic. Perfect, okay. Perfect.
I'm not going to spend more time on this. I'm having still fun in this world, which I'm working in for over 20 years. And a couple of years ago, I took up the challenge to write a book. Actually, it was longer ago that I already suggested Pact to do this. But I think the time was there in 2018, 2009 to get that done. If you want to contact me related to this session or automated testing, these are a couple of handles you can use. The Twitter handle, my email handle, or my blog website, which was offline for a while, but since a month it's already working nicely. Second version of the book is going to be released in January. I'm working hard to get things done at the moment. The last things are almost finished, so hopefully it's finished within a couple of weeks. So feel free to get a copy, of course. I will be very pleased if you do. And also feel free, and that's even more important, to contact me on anything you would like to get clearance on. For today, I didn't put up an agenda, but I put up a problem statement. What is the problem I want to tackle in this session or with this topic? The thing is, with testing APIs, or let's say if you're using services, web services, in essence, there are always two separate processes, two separate systems communicating together. So we have a client calling, the calling process, and we have a server, the code process. And that's, in this context, our API. Now, if it were another service, an external service we don't have control of, it would be a different story. It is also discussed in the book, but that would be something what is called test doubling or mocking or mimicking or whatever. Yeah. So here we can use both of them. If you access an external service and want to check your software working against that, you are going to actually mimic that external service. But here we are going to use our external service. Yeah. So how do we do that? That's actually, let's say that was the goal of what I've written in the book and what the goal is of today. So normally you run on two independent systems. You have a piece of software, the client calling, another piece of software, the server, which is going to respond to that call. Yeah. So how to control both in our test run? That's one main problem or challenge, and the other one is how to code the API tests easily. I'm not an API expert, as I already mentioned. I'm not an HTTP programmer, coder, whatever you want to call it. I know some things about that, but I'm not experienced in that, and I don't want to spend too much time. So the challenge are those two things. Sorry for the short, let's say, interruption, hiccup on this. Let's first discuss the generic test flow. So any test has a same flow. Yeah, and that's what I want to also discuss about, bringing this into the broader context of test automation. There is also always something to be set up, some data to be set up. There is a part to be performed, an action that you want to test actually, and then the outcome of that action is what you want to verify. The result of that action needs to be verified. This is always like that. The coloring I'm using in the book too, every time red, green, blue, that's the way I, let's say, mark things that here is data set up, here is an action done, here's a verification. This is irrespective of whatever test you do. If you do it manually, automated, if you're API testing, if you're testing, I don't know what else kind of feature, it's always like this. Yeah. So you might know that I've been advocating this pattern, what is called acceptance test driven development, where the setup call is called a given, the execution part is called a when, and the verification part is called then. Multiple givens possible, multiple thens possible, and preferably in one test you only have one action that you're going to verify. Yeah. By the way, those who are more used or have been more used to unit testing, where we have this pattern AAA, arrange, act, accept, it's in the end the same. For me, if you would ask me, oh Luc, or tell me, Luc, oh yeah, but for unit testing you use AAA, I don't care what you call it. I mean, it's always the same, and I will stick to this one to be consistent. And as some might know, I've been building tools around it. I'm still in a project for a VS Code extension on this, and which we pick up again when the book is released. But it's always this structure. As a small example, I've set up a project on GitHub which I call test automation examples, and one of them is related to automatic text insertion on documents. And if you take this small example, if you add a line to a sales invoice for an item where automatic extended text is enabled and text are provided, that's a scenario that you could test. It's a functional scenario, and that would look like I need to have an item with the respective thing set up. I need to have a sales invoice. The execution part is, and this business logic is executed only in pages, while I need to open up a sales invoice page where I add that line, and then I find out the verification part. I find out that the extended text lines or one line is added to the sales invoice. Yeah, it's always this build up, any test you do. And with test automation, you need to give those details. I mean, manual testers, they have experience, they sit down, they have what I called an internal test plan, and they execute things. The hard thing about this, I think, or the weak thing about this is that often you don't know what they exactly tested. Yeah, there is no control on a list where things have been marked. There might be, but very often it's done and they say it's okay. With test automation, we need to be able to code this, and so we need to have all the details defined, and then it's also repeatable and verifiable afterwards. This is the test that has been executed. Well, generic test flow, and we will apply this also to our API test. A short introduction on this one for those who haven't worked on it, or a repeat for others. So how about API tests, the API test flow? Well, let's first discuss the three technical challenges we have with API tests. First of all, how do we control the test flow? We have actually two processes, a server and a client. How do we control that? Yeah, that's one side. Next to that, how do we authenticate? The client calling the server needs to authenticate. And I want to keep it as simple as possible. And I'm following the line that Microsoft has chosen to do. There's, let's say you could argue about this, and I did this presentation over a week ago at the Dutch Dynamics in the Netherlands, and Waldo was there, and Waldo said, well, maybe we could do this a little bit different, but I'll tell you the story that I had been working on. And as a third challenge, of course, we need to set up that interaction. I mean, if it's authenticated, what do I send as a client to the server, and what do I get back, and etc. So 3 technical challenges. I'll address them one by one. So how to control that test flow where the execution takes place in 2 different processes, the client and the server. You might say 2 different systems, but in the end, and that's the nice thing here, we can have our API on board in the same environment where we're going to execute our test code. Yeah, so the client is a process in the same database as the server is. Yeah, and we'll do some quasi switching between the 2. Of course, in the end, when the HTTP call is done to that API, that server is a separate process. Yeah, so on the same database, but a separate process. So some things happen client side, other things happen server side. In the flow, the normal flow of calling, not the test situation, but the normal flow, we have on client side the part where we set up and exercise the REST request. Yeah, and once the server has handled it, we receive the response. That's what's done client side. Server side, that needs to process the REST request. In a simple diagram, it looks like this. Yeah? Client side on the top, server side on the bottom part, setting up the request, sending the request, processing the request, receiving the request, and you could say, or receiving the response, and then, yeah, part of that is processing the response, whatever you want to do. But let's restrict it to this interaction between the 2. If we move into the test flow, my diagram shows that I have a server side and a client side, and actually I deliberately left out the processing of the requests. But bear that in mind, that will still happen. But the test flow, I'm looking at the test flow. I need to prepare some data on the server side. Yeah, even though, and that's where what I call quasi switching, or quasi, I don't know what the right pronunciation is, quasi switching between server side and client side in my test flow. I need to have some data, and I will take an example. There is some data in the database. My test is doing a call upon that API, asking for a record, a lookup value record. It's the case from my book. So that record should be there in the database server side. Yeah. Then on client side, I need to prepare my request. I need to send it, of course. I need to receive the response. I need to verify the response as a part of the test. And if needed, if I send, for example, a post call to the server, I need to verify on the server side that something has been updated. Yeah. So this is the test flow. Yeah. If I put it up here, you will see that the line in between is going to move away. Actually, the test flow is in one process. Yeah. Although we're mimicking that we're setting up data for the server side to be called upon from client side and verified through response, but also eventually, if we do something like a post or a patch call to our API, data is changed or data is created. So we need to verify indeed that that data is there. So the test flow is this. Yeah. Sending that request, of course, triggers a real server-side part that is going to process that request. Yeah. The given part is data setup, either setting up a record that is going to be referenced through your or called upon through your request, and we need to set up some data for our client-side call. Yeah, for example, if you do a patch, you might have a record, you want to modify it. Yeah, so we need to set up a JSON object that has the modification in it of the original object. Yeah. Every time this is well, more or less, this is the same setup. It might be that we don't need to set up data on the server already because we're going to do a post, we're going to create a new record. It might be that we don't need to verify changes because we're only going to do a get. So we call upon the system to return some record information and some lookup value, and then we don't need to verify the part on the server side because nothing has changed. We only need to verify the response. So some things might be left out, some things well, do only happen on the server side part. Yeah, so this is the test flow. Yeah, so actually this is not really server side. This is one Business Central process. As we're in the same database, I can add a record from that process. As we're in the same database, I can verify the changes made through or due to this REST call. Yeah? So we will, in the automated test, as I said, quasi switch between client and server side. Yeah? Setting up some data on the server, well, in the same database as it is, as it looks like, mimicking as it was done on the server side, and we might need to verify some things. However, this request is going to call upon a real API, and that's going to be a second session. Yeah. However, that's in the same database, so everything that we need to set up and check at the end is in our control. Yeah. That's the whole idea behind this. So if you look at it from this red, green, blue structure, the setup is we need to set up data on server side and prepare a client REST request. We need to exercise being setting up that final request and sending it out, receiving the response, and on server side we might need to check changes that has been done on the database, and on the client side the resulting REST request response. Yeah. So remember this blue, green, blue, red, green, blue. It's always the same. So as, of course, this test flow is in one process and actually triggering through this REST request another session, we're running two sessions in this environment. Those who have been working with test automation, those surely have been listening to me before. I'm a high, I'm highly in favor of running my tests in isolation. I want my system to start at a certain setup and then run the tests, and once the tests are done, we're back at that same setup, whatever has been created in between in the tests. Yeah. However, that's not going to be possible here. As we have two sessions, we need to really commit the data to the database. Otherwise, that second session might run into, well, locks or whatever, something not yet finished and accessible for that second session. We will see later. So we need to run our tests outside of isolation. Yeah. Okay. The second challenge, authentication. How to handle the authentication of the client when it calls the server. Yeah. So before it can really invoke an action on the server side. Well, the shortcut is we're going to ignore it. And that's the trick Microsoft is, and I followed that one. They remove all user-related data and run the tests on an environment where Windows authentication has been set up. I don't know if it technically is exactly the same, but it reminds me of the olden days where we had, let's say, the old, what we later called the classic client, connecting directly to a server file, or actually a database file or whatever, but also to the server. If there is no user data, you can access it. Yeah. With Windows authentication as such and user password, there are some challenges here, but with Windows authentication, if you, for example, set up a local installation from a DVD like we used to do in the past and don't add any user related data, or actually remove it from it, you can go in it without any authentication, and you can call upon an API from that system without any authentication. Yeah, the same applies to a Docker environment. If you have a Docker container, Windows authentication, and remove, and there's a part in the script I showed later, Freddie helped me on that one, where you can let the BC container, new BC container commandlet, add some script to that it's not going to add any user data. So that's the shortcut to do that. And like Waldo said, well, he will probably find some way to do it differently, but this is the approach I took. As said, I'm not an expert on this, and I wanted to know and to learn how Microsoft is doing it and why they do it this way. So I'll demo some things around this later on, but this is the approach. And as explicitly mentioned here, can only be done using Windows authentication on your NST, which is a challenge, and that's where Waldo was challenged for pipelining. In pipelines, using Azure DevOps, connecting to another system, etc., you preferably don't want Windows authentication to be used. So how do you go about with user password, etc.? So let's see when Waldo comes up with a solution for that, or maybe someone here like Aranjan or whatever. For now, let's leave that. The challenge here is we need to set up a BC environment to use Windows authentication. Well, that's not a big challenge, but that's part of the challenge. We need to remove all user and user-related data from the database. We need to deploy, of course, our extension and test the code, and then run the tests without test isolation. So there is a test runner called testrunner-isol.disabled with the ID. And if we use that one, then things run fine. By the way, about the removal of the user data, I've created a simple SQL query, which is also used for the book and to be found on the repo Pact owns part of the book or relates to the book. These are typically all the tables where you need to be sure that no data is in it. Yeah? I found out that sometimes it creates some records there. I don't know exactly when. That's then not often that bad, but you could rerun this. Another option, as I said, create a Docker container with valid Windows credentials. That was also a good thing today. I had to change my Windows password last weekend, and this morning I started to create a new Docker container, and that worked fine, but it uses the old credentials and I could not use my system, so I had to change that again to the or rebuild it again with the right password. This is a script I use for creating my Docker container locally. It's a relatively simple one, but as you can see here, it adds this script here, which then assures that new BC container helper is not going to add a user to the container. Yeah, and as you can see, I provided partly my Windows credentials, and I set the credentialing here to Windows, or the authentication. Okay. A third option, by the way, is which I found out while working on this, trying a lot of things. This altogether is more than a week of work, trying and erroring, because Microsoft did not share a lot of information. They helped me, but I need to do a lot myself. And I found out if you have a local environment, and probably maybe on Docker also, but on my local environment, I tried this one, restoring a database backup from the product DVD. Also is then a database without any user data. That was a simple one also. That I was very happy to find out that how this worked easily. So work around the authentication. That's the second challenge. The third one is how to set up the client-server interaction. As said, I'm not an HTTP expert, programming it. Not a lot. I have been in situations where I had the relative advantage that I had colleagues that could do that better. So that's relative because it made me lazy on that. I learned a lot more doing this for the book. I'm still not an expert on it. But what is nice about is that Microsoft has built up a test library with a lot of things. For this client-server interaction, of course, we need to have access to the endpoint, we need to set up a target URL, including a reference to the company we're going to, let's say, read data from or post a new record to, or patch changes, whatever. Then we need to set that request, a get, a delete, a post, or a patch. Sorry, moving the other way around. And of course, we need to set up a couple of things for the content and return type, and eventually send that to the API. Yeah. The advantage of our test run being in the same environment is that we can easily, code can easily create this URL. We don't need to know what environment we're going to talk to. So we're talking to ourselves. So the URL is the URL of the server I'm on. The company is the company I'm in. So this is part of the library Microsoft created, but that helps me a lot. I made a short demo, which is also in the repo for the book. This is excerpt of the project I created in chapter 13. There is this API page, the lookup value case in short. What is important here is that the table behind this lookup value table behind is actually a simple table with two fields, a code field and a description field, nothing more. Yeah, and it's called lookup value because of the whole case adding a field with a table relation on the customer table, allowing you to select records from this table. That's it. That's enough for now. Yeah. So I've created a page where I have the code column on it called number and the description called display name. And yes, I need to include the system ID. Yeah? And there's a little bit more business rule. The description is not allowed to be empty. So when I change it and make it empty, I should get an error. When I create a record and the description is empty, it also errors. Yeah. I've made a couple of calls here. So calling up on my environment using a REST client in VS Code. So I set up the base URL. I know that I'm calling the API with the publisher, let's say my company, and the group I called automation, and everything inside there. Sorry, my API here is V1 API version 1, so that should be then accessible. So I can get the information from the database, looking at what kind of let's say entities I do have, the companies inside the database. So I have one company, of course, Cronus, and then I could reference the, for the first company, the only one, I could reference the lookup value table showing that it has 2 records. Yeah, a short demo. I'm not going to do much more about this. In this file, there are things like that I could post things and patch things. Well, we could run this one, post it, and then see that we do get indeed a new extra record, not only the first, sorry, this is the first record, this one the old, so not only the first and the second, but also a new one. Okay, of course, this is not the way we're going to, let's say, set up our features or test our features in Business Central, making AL test code. That's what is going to be somewhat different, but as a short demo, this is what the interaction is about. So the REST client is very handy to check things, but eventually, of course, it's not the way to address it from AL code. So what code do we need to set up? Yeah, we need to set up and send an HTTP request to the right endpoint. So we need to have that target URL, and we need to be able to receive and check it. Well, for this, Microsoft has come to the rescue, you could say. Surely for me, it has made my life much easier. And typically, they stored everything in a library called Graph. Graph is that bigger story of all kind of entities that or interaction between entities, enabling that on the higher scale of Dynamics 365, or maybe even the bigger world than that. This library graph has a whole bunch of reusable functions for handling, for setting up your and handling your REST calls. Yeah, so it's wrapping things in it, and it might, of course, show to be not always to the advantage, because having libraries might restrict you too much. But for what I'm going to show and for the basic things, surely, and I think even more than that, but I'm not going to claim that right now, but surely will be of a lot of help to you. So what are we going to do? Our test example. So I quickly showed you already in my VS Code project this lookup values API, a V1 API. There are a number of properties you need to set, and I condensed it a bit to bring it in view. I left out some code, but the most important part is there. I have 3 columns. Yeah, and let's say with the API naming conventions, we call this ID, this number, this display name using this camel casing. There is some additional business logic implemented, as I told you. If the description is empty, it should error. And yes, my API is defined by the fact it's a page of type API, my version, group, etc. And the entity set name is called lookup values. Yes, I learned a lot of things also here. It's case sensitive, and I didn't get things working, and after an hour, with some help, I found out, oh gee, I forgotten to put in my test code an uppercase V here. While this was clearly uppercase V, I learned it the hard way, like probably many of us do in different ways. So this is my target. This is, let's say, what is the server side thing, and that's what we're going to call upon from the client side. So what scenario? My, let's say, evangelism is, don't start coding if you don't have a test plan, if you don't have a plan. What kind of tests, what kind of scenarios do you have? I understand, and I always see, last week also, having developers in a course, and then I tell them this is the way you should do that, and then they sit down, and the first thing they do is start coding instead of starting to define the scenarios. Do it your way, the best that fits you, but the reason why I'm advocating this is that in the end, you might find a couple of scenarios, but whatever, but you will often not have the full stretch, yeah, not covering things well enough. And this is something discussable, debatable, reviewable if you define your scenarios. This is the scenario level first, and each scenario do get details. And this is the discipline I perform. I'm not going to code if I don't have a scenario. Yeah. Learn it your way, but take it from me, you will be more efficient. You get more inclusion of other people in your projects because they are able to read this. They are able to review it, to tell you, hey, did you think about it? Of course, this is a simple one. I took out 2 scenarios, as you saw, the get lookup value and the modify lookup value. Everything is in all the other tests also in my VS Code project. I'm not going to discuss all the details, but in short, the get part is I need to have a lookup value. So that's the data setup side. Let's say I need to have on my server, and I need to commit it. Yeah, because it's actually going to be picked up by another process. So it needs to be committed. Yeah, I'm going to set up, of course, and send a get request for that lookup value. Yeah, I know in the same flow I created that one, so I know exactly which record I want. That's the advantage of this test flow in the same environment. And eventually, when I get a response, I receive it and I can verify it. Let's say in this test flow, I don't need to check anything between quotes server side because there's nothing changed. The record is still there. I could do it, but it doesn't add a lot to it. So this is one scenario ending up in this code. Yeah, I create a committed lookup value, and this is also part of my discipline and let's say my evangelism. I hardly write any nerdy code here. I always use helper functions that embed the real code. I'll show you later the real code behind. For two reasons, this is readable by almost anybody. I always exaggerate. My mother, she's not living anymore, but she could read very well English. She can read this. Yeah, maybe not fully understand it, but my purpose in coding is that anybody at this level should be able to read this, because then you have valid discussions with anybody in a fast mode. If this is only showing the real code behind it, it's difficult to discuss. Yeah, even for yourself, getting back to the code after a number of weeks, months, years, it's often a challenge. You see 3 lines of code. You will see that altogether this test is not more than 12 lines of code or whatever. Yeah? So this is one test. Yeah? Then the other one, the modify, that's a little bit more, because I need to have a committed lookup value on the server side, but I need to prepare my JSON object to send this patch call. Yeah? I do know what record I'm going to call upon, but I'm going to patch it in that way that the description is going to be changed. And then I'm preparing and sending that patch request, receiving the response, verifying the response, and then of course I need to be quasi server side check that lookup value, the updated lookup value, is to be found in the database. Yeah? So how does this code for the test look like? It looks like this. Yeah? I can reuse this function, and that's also one of the reasons to have those helper functions. This is a quick reuse, and this one here, verify lookup value and response, I also had already set up on the other one. The only thing is that I'm not going to use the same lookup value, but the temporary lookup value, the one I created that JSON object with. But working this way, I have quickly available reusable parts. Yeah? So 2 parts are reusable. All right, so a demo. Let's first have a look at my clients. So I have 3 environments, and I'll need to refresh them. One environment is this environment in a Docker container with user password. Yeah? It should show you that here are the lookup values and the new one that was created. Yeah, but I'm going to now show you the AL test tool, and I'm going to put that test code unit there. Oh yeah, let's do as I removed it from the others, forgotten to remove it from here. So I'm going to add this one to my test tool. I want it to be clean, and this is isolation. But more important, this is a user password environment. And if I'm going to run my tests, it's going to error and tell me that I don't have access. Yeah, it's unauthorized, because I cannot call with the code I'm using. I cannot provide my credentials. I'm executing or implementing that trick of having an environment with Windows authentication with no user data quickly allows me to enter it. You could argue, Luc, don't you want to check that authentication in your tests? Might be, but for most of the tests, if you have a whole bunch of APIs, do I need to check every time the authentication? No, I want to test the business logic. You could then argue the authentication is part of that. Yeah, it's not nonsense, but for me at this moment the focus is I want to see if my API is doing the work, and the authentication, that's fine with me at the moment. Yeah, this is debatable, I know, but testing is also about focusing on the things you want to focus on. You cannot cover everything every time, and surely if you every call is going to need to check the authentication, well, if it works once, it works twice. There's no reason to do that. Yeah, so it's a bit blunt, but that's also about testing, focusing on the things you need to verify. This is not going to work. I don't have access to it. Another environment, this one is also a Docker environment with Windows authentication. Yeah, test isolation is on. Let's add that code unit here, and let's run the test. And here we're going to get a different error. The first time run, or if I waited a long time, it's going to need some warming up. Typically, if I run it the second time, it's much faster. This might take 10 seconds or whatever. The other one, I was lucky that it apparently was, well, maybe due to the authentication. But here, not everything fails, but I do get a failure here because we could not update the data right now. This is about, let's say, a locking part on it. So here, some things do succeed, especially the get. I mean, getting a record is not that difficult, but I'm authenticated. I can access it. Yeah. If I change this test runner to one without isolation, if we run everything again, that will be faster anyway. Second run, you see, it's quite fast. Oh yeah, that's the case. With the first one, I do get some data created, and I need to clear it up. It's just this switch. So let's clean everything out here first and then rerun everything again. It's because the first one was partly well, mainly with test isolation, but the creation happens on the other system, and there it's creating a new record, and it's reusing that number here. So I need to update a couple of things here, which normally, if I didn't do it with the isolation part, you wouldn't run into. But typically, it does create some data which is committed by the call to that API. So if I run it now, it would be successful, and every time I run, you can see that the duration changing, it runs fine. Yeah? So all my tests are executed. I also have a local environment, a BC18 environment. I could do the same. It's also Windows authentication. It works fine. If we have a look at the code, yeah, so let's close those two windows. I'll show you the tests. So here, and let's fold this. So I have those 6 scenarios: let's say the get, the delete, the patch, and the post. I deliberately did it that way, although you could say do it the CRUD way, create it, whatever, read it, update it, and delete it. But I wanted to first check that I can get that record. That works nice. That's the most simple one. And then deletion of a record, whatever. So looking at the code here, you might recognize this from, let's zoom in, recognize it from my sheet. What's behind this? So here I just have a simple action that creates a record using a function from a library that I created in the book. And this is at the end of the book, so the library is available. And I commit that data. Yeah, I need to commit it to unlock tables to allow that web service or that API to access the data. Yeah, then verifying. Let's take that part first. So how do we do the verification? Well, I just need to check whether that in that JSON object, in the response, that JSON object is not empty, and the library graph management, that library which I already mentioned, provides a number of helper functions that verifies whether there's an ID in the JSON or specifically looking for a certain property and value in that JSON object. We could jump into this one and see what it's doing. Yeah, I'm very happy. I understand quite some things of JSON, but I hardly program against it. This saved me a lot of time. By the way, 4 lines of code, 2 lines of code in the commit and create function, 3 lines of code in the test function. So altogether we have 9 lines of code so far. And then this part, which is the most valuable part for me in that sense, where this library is helping me. You see, 10 lines of code. That's all I need to program to get this test working. That's a standard function for setting get. Well, I'm lying a little bit. I create this one, so I was at 10 lines. So this one is a function embedding another call to standard library function. This actually creates that target URL based upon the fact that it can fetch the server URL. It needs to add, of course, this node in the URL, and it needs to get handed over the ID for the record that I'm going to access, and the page I'm going to call upon. Yeah. So the URL, I don't need to think about that. Yeah. Of course, I've been stepping into it to try to understand well enough. Does this work every time? Yes, it works every time. So 10 lines of code, and I have an API test testing my get part. Yeah. So for the modify part, a little bit more. Of course, I need to create my JSON object. So I have a helper function also making use of some standard library functions here, letting me create that JSON object, creating also a temporary lookup value object, so a record for me that I can then use to go into the response and find, hey, is this indeed to be found in the response? So we looked at this one. This one is not much different, except for the fact that, of course, we're going to need to hand over another body to it. And here is similar to the other one, not a get, but a patch, providing the target URL, the request body, because I'm now wanting to change it, modify it, and of course also receiving the response that we're going to verify. Next to the fact that, oh, sorry, I pushed the wrong button here, but next to the fact that I need to add an extra given, I have an extra, then I need to verify that that record in the database is indeed changed. Yeah, so the lookup value is the same one, the code is the same one, but the description is a different description. Okay, I think we're nicely on time. This is the end of what I wanted to show you and tell you. A couple of notes. You can check, of course, outside of the isolation that lookup values are created. You saw me that I did need to remove some, and there's a number series from a standard library created that I needed to remove to get things working right without the isolation. So I can see data was added to the database. Running the tests needs to be done outside of isolation. If I do with isolation, I did not show you explicitly well enough this session, but you can see that then not a lot of data is not stored in the database at the end. It's all rolled back. And yes, user data, I showed you the scripts, but I could also show you that the data, those tables are indeed empty. Okay, that's my story. I hope the sound was stable enough right now, and thanks for putting your notes on that, so we could improve on that. And William,
yeah, the
thanks.
sound was great. Once you changed your mic, it was great.
Okay, great. Then I'll use it next time also. I had some issues with this in the past, but there are no questions on the...
No questions.
Questions?
You know what that means? It means either everybody was so dazzled or they were left behind. But yeah, no questions. It's unusual. You normally get bombarded with questions, but I'm guessing that there was a lot of information you just hit us with.
Yeah, it was a quick one. Yeah, as said, I worked on this more than a week to get it done, and then some other time to write about it in the book. And yes, there are a lot more details in the book. I see.
Well, I think one of the interesting things is we had less than 10% of people drop out of the session. So that's we never see that. Normally, you get a lot of people that just join and then drop out, but less than 10% dropout is amazing. So that means 90% of people sat through the entire thing to listen to it. So they were interested.
Yeah, great. I'm sneak peeking also on the questions. I see there is a question from Tim.
Yeah. How to clean up the environment after API tests.
Yeah, that's a good one. Roughly is well, there's two sides, of course. When I'm executing tests in the end, they're part of my pipeline. As I post already. That's a challenge with the authentication. For example, if you're using Azure DevOps environment, etc., that typically your Docker, I'm using Docker in that context too, your Docker container is removed and built up with every pipeline. And typically that's what I would be doing here too. But of course, you could write a cleanup part at the end so that it's executed at the end of a test, like an initialize thing that is executed once for all the tests. And if you run a test individually, it's also executed. You could write a cleanup part to get rid of those records. But of course, then you need to be sure what to remove. So that would be a strategy.
Okay. And then we got Magnus asks, what's the strategy for using no test isolation? In this case, delete records after test.
Yeah, that relates to Tim's question actually. Yeah? So yes, you have to remove them afterwards. So either if you have something automated here, make sure to recreate your Docker container or attach a clean database to it. I think in the end that's something you would like to do anyway, that you start from the same thing. Cleaning up, writing your own cleanup routines is a good in between, although have to be sure that it's always cleaning up the same things, that you're back to normal. On the other hand, you might have seen that I did push the button and push the button. My tests are set up that they're not having any problems with having those records still sticking in the database. But theoretically, if you do this till the end of time, your database gets cluttered. So this is not the ideal way, but it's also not the wrong way.
Okay. So we have a few comments, but I'll just go to the questions first because they need your answer. And we've got one from Chris saying, you're always favoring Docker. Are you working differently?
No, I'm preferably working with Docker. Yeah, so
Okay.
This environment, this one is a local environment. I did do that for the book to check how does it work when I do it locally. But I hardly do any, so I mean locally, my Docker is also locally, but a real local installation from the product DVD, I hardly do that anymore. So I really fancy working with Docker, which is easy to recreate, etc. That makes my life so much easier, also in the context of testing.
Okay, so we only have a few seconds left, so just there's a few things I'm going to have to skip, but a question we have is, can a strategy be to have a special prepped database attached to Docker for every test?
No, the strategy in general for automated tests is work with Cronus. Preferably work with an empty database, with an empty company, but I work with Cronus because I use a lot of Microsoft libraries, and some of the libraries make use of some data still that is in Cronus. It's expected to be there. Some might have experienced, if you run your tests in a sandbox Docker installation, that there's lesser data there and then the libraries go astray. So I preferably use Docker with an on-prem Docker a BC container, on-prem BC container, because then I can make use of the libraries, which is not fully data agnostic because it needs to have data in Cronus, but I always work on Cronus with my tests.
Okay, all right, so we've got no more time. We're running out. We've got a few seconds. I just want to say thank you to Jeremy, who posted on Discord to get people joining today, which thank you, Jeremy. Yep. And thank you to Aaron, who has suggested that he'd be happy to work out the authentication challenge. So yep. Contact Aaron. Thanks, AJ, for that. So I think we covered all the questions, a lot of comments, thanks, and that sort of thing. So thank you, everybody. Very, very good. Again, thank you to 4Nav for sponsoring this session and making it happen. It's very much appreciated. Luc, any last words in the last 7 seconds of our session?
There was one question of Tim still there, but I'll ping you on that.
Which one? You answered it.
No, there was one left on regarding duration, but that's not a problem. I'll ping him on that.
Why don't I have it? Oh, he must have sent it to you directly. All right, we're out of time.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, okay, bye.